What time is it there? 6 o'clock, yeah?
Yes, yes. No, it's 5. It's the same as Bangkok time.
Okay. All right. We are live now. Um, welcome to the 4C Dialogue Live series on democratic struggles across Asia and in other parts of the world. The good afternoon to you in Bangkok, Myanmar, Phnom Penh, and also early good evening to you in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. I'm Zani, the host and the co-founder of 4C, and I have a distinct pleasure and honor to host one of the best-known researchers and also human rights advocates across Asia. He is Dr. James Gomez, the regional director of Asia Center, and he has several decades of research and activism on rights violations, and he knows the region very, very intimately. He was with the Amnesty International for a number of years as the regional director for the organization, and he now directs the Asia Center research and advocacy network out of Southeast Asia. James, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Zani. Great to be here. It's interesting that we're going to be speaking about Myanmar and Singapore. Me being from Singapore, I'm often asked, what's Singapore up to when it comes to Burma, and what's this, stuff about Singapore issuing, major statements that, it's not keen with what the military is doing right now. So this is a great opportunity to kind of, reflect on recent comments coming out of Singapore in the context of ASEAN vis-a-vis the coup, the military junta, and just to, unpack the situation by looking back, really, the relationship Singapore has had for a very long time with Myanmar. And can current statements, dissolve itself from responsibility when it comes to what's happening in Myanmar today?
Yeah, I think Singapore, Myanmar, or Burma, even before the country's name was changed to Myanmar after the coup in 1988, internal. I mean, it's more like a direct military rule, the reasserting itself after 25 years of, so-called socialist party rule. The late Lee Kuan Yew and Burma's dictator General Ne Win, they were contemporaries, and they were also, quite a tight sort of autocrats, right? And some years ago, I met a Singaporean diplomat. He must be now quite senior. He was a second in command of the Singaporean High Commission in London. This Singaporean Chinese diplomat, and he mentioned to me, Lee Kuan Yew assigned him to look after General Ne Win when Ne Win was, stuck in a transit in Singapore, and apparently, the Burmese military leaders, over the last, 40, 50 years, have very much felt very much at home in Singapore. I know, like, some of the younger generation Burmese military officers from General Kinyon's time, who own, the prime properties and also businesses and offices in Singapore, in Clarke Quay, and some of the, the posh offices in, I think maybe like Orchard Street, that's a main street, as you know, business district. can you give a sense of this, commercial and financial connection, between Singapore and the Burmese military? And then like we go on to looking at the arms dealers and cronies, and as well as the some of the drug kingpins that have reportedly shelved their money or parked their wealth in the different Singaporean banks, and also give us a sense of how big Singapore's financial package in terms of its foreign direct investment, business ties, joint ventures.
Right. Yeah. Thanks very much, Zani, for having me here and the opportunity to have a conversation around these issues. As you mentioned, anecdotally about the higher level, relationship between, leaders in the military of both countries. I would also like to anecdotally, mention at the lower level, every time I've been to Yangon, when I take a taxi, when they ask where I'm from and I say from Singapore, it's either the taxi driver has had worked in Singapore or has a family member who has worked in Singapore or studied there. In fact, currently we have something like 200,000 Burmese living, working, studying in Singapore. So that's a large number of Burmese in Singapore. If you take, over the 50 million population, that's a significant size in Singapore, and just literally just over an hour's flight from Yangon to Singapore. So that's the level of connection. And both societies have had relationship for over 20, 30 years at many, many levels. But for the purposes of our discussion today, Myanmar's, crooks, drug lords, and tycoons being sheltered in Singapore, and we really want to sort of investigate and unpack the statement. I just will put out some numbers for you and your listeners. First of all, Singapore investments in Myanmar in 2020 was a whopping, US 161 billion. And most of this information are publicly available online. There are many data sources, but this is just to, give you a number. In fact, Singapore is used as a conduit to bypass many of the restrictions, in place in Myanmar and elsewhere. Now, FDI alone, this is after the coup in 2021, was 442.2 million. Now, that's a lot of money. And from October to 21 to March this year, that's just a matter of several months. It's about 297 million. So just to give you, a sense of how much money. Now, the 2022 numbers are not out yet, but you can find the 2021 numbers. Singapore's export to Myanmar, it's over 2 billion. Now, what is interesting, just a touch over 2 billion, but nearly 2 billion, 1.97 billion is fuels, refined fuels. So you see, just there, if you wanted to have leverage over Myanmar, you could just turn off the fuel tap, just there. But of course, it comes at a price of nearly 2 billion. So this is just, a brief context of the numbers in Myanmar, and I will just pass the time back to you to see if I can, support and continue the conversation around this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite staggering, volume of, commercial engagement with the Burmese, primarily with the Burmese military, because state and the Burmese military has the lion's share of the national economy. If we're talking about the formal economy, like these numbers are on the side of the the economic sector that we would call formal or official economy, right? And there's also informal or unofficial or sort of like a, shadowy type of commercial transactions, right? That we don't know. That's one of the things that we want to shed some light on, particularly given your expertise as a scholar on this issue. There's also a political dimension because General Kim Yun, who was a protege to General Ne Win, the first dictator, and from 1962 to 1988, he was telling the Al Jazeera a documentary filmmaker Shahida from the UK and Uzbek that the late Lee Kuan Yew was extremely helpful to the Burmese military leaders after General Ne Win, felt he needed to officially resign. This is the ex-head of the military intelligence and saying, Lee Kuan Yew was very, very helpful in trying to make us look, meaning that make the Burmese military regime and leaders look more presentable and acceptable to the world, right? So Singapore was helping with the image management of the regime that has come to be hated, universally by the Burmese people from different sectors and ethnic communities. That aside, as you know, the Bloomberg, recently ran a very comprehensive investigative article looking at the best known or the most infamous Burmese crony, Teza, who dropped out of the Defense Services Academy. Teza is my contemporary, maybe a year or so younger. He dropped out of the Defense Services Academy, from which virtually all new generation Burmese dictators are drawn, including the current, junta head, Min Aung Hlaing. Can you tell us what you know about, the cronies and arms dealers like Teza, and their ties, economic and otherwise, to Singapore? Teza owns properties in Singapore. I know for a fact that he was running an office in Singapore, in the last 30 years, from which he would make arms deals on behalf of the Burmese military regime. And then Bloomberg has a rather well-researched and detailed reporting on this. And what else do you know? And can you tell us?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're coming to the heart of the matter: the crooks, drug lords, and tycoons. Either based or operating out of Singapore. And you're right. Most of the investigative pieces, first of all, done outside of Singapore. You will never have the Straits Times, running an investigative piece on that, even though, most of the data is probably, available in Singapore. So that's the irony of it. So apart from Bloomberg, which you mentioned, there's the Burmese News International, as well as Justice for Myanmar, that have done reports, often covertly gathering information. So, but in terms of context, Singapore has always been selling arms. So if you look at the global index and ranking, as early as the 2000s, Singapore was actually ranked 20th in the world. Right now, it's for 41 in the world in terms of selling arms. So I think, the arms business has always been there. In the early days, in the late 80s, there are reports, even in the Irrawaddy in early 2000, of Singapore government, having relationship with the military in Myanmar, selling arms. So these are historical facts, and what Singapore has become for the Burmese military and the junta, especially post-coup, Singapore has become a trading hub. So if we look at, investigative reports such as those published by the Burma News International, they will report there are at least 78 Myanmar-based companies brokering for the military. And at least, half of them, 38 of them are subsidiaries or associated companies in Singapore. Now, that's a large number, right? And if you look at the report, which is, publicly available, they actually break down, the names of the companies and even list the directors, up to almost 258 directors across these many companies. So for once, there's clearly evidence. Again, coming from outside of Singapore by these investigative reports, which says that there's a fair bit of companies here doing arms dealing and trading. In fact, you will find information on the internet which says it's very easy to become an arms dealer in Singapore as long as you have contracts for both sides to buy and supply arms. You're an arms dealer. So that, I think, is something that we have to keep in mind. One, historically, Singapore has been selling arms directly. It is ranked fairly high in the world in terms of being an arms seller and supplier. And then it has allowed, companies, subsidiaries or associated companies associated with Myanmar-based companies to trade with arms. Now, this is what the reports from outside have said. Now, knowing Singapore and the Singapore Speak, if you bring that more publicly, I think that it would be challenged, and that's where we can do the investigation further to really dig up to see, what's behind all of this. Right. Now, let's move on to the other point that you mentioned, which was about the drug lords. Now, there's only this one story that has been circulating for about nearly good 20 years, which is about, Loh Sin Han. He's since passed on.
Yeah, Singapore Sling or something?
That's right. And he's, very famous Asia World Company Limited.
Right.
Now, it's, if you look through old reports as far back as 20 years, you will see that, Singapore invested in many of the hotel developments associated with his companies in Myanmar. And later on, his son, Stephen, who married, Stephen Law, who married a Singaporean lady, Sylvia Ng, and has, joint venture companies. And, again, it's public knowledge in terms of the news out there. The U.S. U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control also blacklisted it because of its the company's historical involvement in the drug trade.
Sorry to interrupt, but he also has the official licenses to run the Rangoon port, right? You're talking about Singapore listed or Singapore, partially Singapore-based, ex-drug lord, right? His father was, one of the world's most notorious drug kingpins, Loh Sin Kong, and he runs the port of Rangoon, and you're talking about, the shipment of anything illicit, goods. I mean, what better position do you want to be than like control the port, secure residency and contracts in Singapore, and has the backing of the Burmese military that would do anything to keep themselves in power. So this is a very convenient web of ties that this ex-drug lord maintained. So is it fair to say that the drug money must have been laundered through Singaporean financial systems?
Well, that's the assumption, and that's the speculation that most of this reports coming out of Singapore allege. But at the end of the day, we need a smoking gun. Without a smoking gun, without the forensic, you'll have both the Burmese and the Singapore side coming back to say, hey, where's the evidence? Where's the smoking gun? That's their traditional retort.
Well, there's like Swiss banks. Swiss banks are the I think like Singaporean banking sector was modeled after Swiss banks. Yeah, because Swiss banks, they were doing business with virtually everyone, including the Nazis, right? And the Nazis would melt down the gold, from the Jewish victims at places like Auschwitz. I visited these places, and in these like guest chambers and crematoriums. They were designed in such a way that there would be a room, a small cell within the complex of crematorium and guest chambers. There will be a room, a small cellar, where the gold teeth will be melted down. This is no joke. You see what I mean? Because at Auschwitz, at almost like 1 million, the Nazi victims, 90+% were Jewish victims from Eastern Europe, like Hungary and other places. And they will be gassed to death, right? In half an hour, they're dead. And then 200, staff of the Auschwitz crematoriums, they will clean up the bodies, and then they will extract the gold from the dead bodies, and then they will melt down the gold, and then that will be deposited by SS with Switzerland, that had the neutrality pact. And so, this is a extremely notorious case. But the Singaporean banks are also, shielding themselves with very, very strict confidentiality, requirements, right? Look, I have had conversations with the U.S. State Department officials, and Singapore is a very close non-NATO strategic ally of the United States, and the U.S. Diplomats would tell me Singapore, would just not cooperate. You see what I mean? And using the banking laws as the shield, from having to disclose this kind of dodgy transactions, right? And anyone who's done any research on the money laundering around the world would know, a lot of banks and offshore havens, money is usually brought in crates, yeah. The same way vegetables and chickens are brought in, like massive containers, and deposited, and then you just give the bank, whatever percentage, 5%, 10%, 15%, and then there's no questions, and then your money is laundered. So that's the kind of stories that I've heard from different sources. Some of them have done this themselves, and so can you shed light on the Singaporean banking sector and the banks and the Singapore state's relationship? What is there a revolving door between these bank directors and management sector and the Singaporean political the ruling party?
Yeah, you're right to point out that Singapore has its very tight privacy laws around the banking. In addition, I think I'll draw your attention to an old colonial law, the Official Secrets Act. So that's also very much in play. And
That's from the British colonial era.
yeah, that's right. I mean, any tool that they can use, they keep. So that's why you have a dearth of information. And secondly, you have a culture of fear and self-censorship. So nobody really wants to, sort of be the whistleblower, so to speak. You will find that even with the rise of new technology, WhatsApp group, just to give you a simple example, so even during COVID-19, when staff, medical staff, nursing staff who were privy to, COVID infection rates and announcements and changes in policies, who had it, in good authority a little bit before the public, and shared that information to family and friends through WhatsApp group. These people were, taken to task for breaking the official secrets. I know that's the type of rigidity and information control that allows Singapore to maintain the false veneer of what it really is, because it hides a lot of things underneath. So it's not about being transparent. Now, if you poke it a little bit further and say, why this transparency, and then they will pull out it's for national security, or you'll get the silent treatment. They will just ignore you. So that's the kind of regime we are dealing with. Now that is why I think to have a clearer understanding of the Singapore situation, we really need more evidence from the Myanmar end. Now, if there are containers of hard cash being loaded and sent to Singapore, then we need photos and evidence of it from the Myanmar side. Especially when they are being loaded up. So that's kind of, and additionally, I mentioned earlier, there are about 200,000, Burmese living in Singapore. A fair bit of them have become citizens as well as hold permanent residency. So you have a large intelligence pool in Singapore, and I think they also need to do their part in terms of just keeping their eyes and ears open in terms of what's really out there in Singapore and happening. Now, on that regard, I just want to say that the Burmese nationals in Singapore, presently are playing a key role in raising funds to support the civil disobedience movement. They've collected lots of money, and they send the money through proxy. So that's happening. But what I'm really saying is in relation to this, issue of relationship with the junta, because that's really the bit that'll break the camel's back. I think we need, more information. But I want to circle back to the issue of the drugs. One of the concerns is because of the dealings with business entities that have historical relationship with the drug trade. So one of the arguments, some of the pieces that has been written by freelance Singaporean journalists as well as those based in the region, is the irony that the drug lords themselves have not been taken to task in Singapore, but instead is the drug mules, many of them who are ethnic minorities that have bear the brunt and have been put to death, right? So death penalty. So I think one of the connections here with Singapore and Myanmar is really the drug trade and why the drug lords are not actively prosecuted, and the other thing would be the ethics of doing business. So this is something that we can hold the card out for Singapore, the way it's done business. you mentioned the historical relationship. Now, the historical relationship that Singapore took under Lee Kuan Yew, it was an opportunist one. While every country of the free world chose not to do trade with the military junta, Singapore saw it as an opportunity and a first mover advantage to a point that they were so entrenched that the number of Singaporeans from the Singapore-linked government companies was huge. Many of them, and I'm not sure whether you're privy of it, many of them who worked for these government entities, later on when they retire, they make a fat paycheck. They take their money and then they open up their own private businesses in Myanmar. So they're literally, everywhere. And I don't think the Burmese understand the extent of the infiltration these chaps, people have, done, and how much, they are being milked for. So unless there's that kind of awareness, I think the Burmese approach to Singapore is one of benevolent generosity. They appreciate the fact that they can, get the Singapore dollar, get some work, and get some education with scholarship, residency, and then citizenship. So it's not unusual, if you just go to public housing, you knock the door, that, literally you will see several Burmese families living in this public housing, and then they'll open the door with the gentleman, wrapped in his longi. So this is increasingly a common sight in Singapore. So because of that, entrenchment and that linkage, I think we need, more from the Burmese community in holding both Myanmar as well as Singapore accountable.
Yeah, no, I want to emphasize what you said, which is I think it is very perceptive and very factual and very important, which is that correct me if I'm wrong. You were saying that the big time crooks like drug lords and whatnot, or ex-lords who have accumulated millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. They launder their money in Singapore and park their wealth there in the form of properties, businesses, and and other the transparently registered companies, right? To do clean business after their dark money has been laundered. What you're saying is that Singapore allows this kind of street criminal, while going after small-time drug mules and execute them, and then build a reputation that Singapore is really tough on drugs and don't bring in 1 kilometer, right? And then if you got caught with 1 kilo of heroin, and then you're almost certainly bound to be executed, right? Death penalty is there. But if you're dealing in hundreds of millions dollars worth of drugs and other illicit items such as arms, you're welcome in Singapore. Correct me if I'm wrong, because that's what I read. Insofar as the arms dealing, out of offices in Singapore ran by Burmese military cronies such as Deza, right? I mean, they live in palatial lives with Ferraris, the massive stately homes by Singapore standards, in prime areas, right? And the other one that I also want to go back to is this, the Lee Kuan Yew taking advantage or seeing Burma as not as a humanitarian or human rights basket case. It's not that human rights is something that Singaporean government really upholds because it's an extremely effective, you know, highly regulated nanny or police state for the citizens and residents there. Uh, but the Burmese situation as one of immense economic and financial opportunity. And then recently, Singaporean, Israeli newspaper Harash had a big expose, looking at declassified Israeli official documents, saying, since 1950s and 60s, Israeli government was very much informed about the Burmese civil war and the weapons that the Burmese military used in the civil war against its own people, and the top echelons, Israeli officials and politicians, they just shrug off and say, yeah, this is a great opportunity to sell arms and to keep the Burmese military on their side when it comes to international votes and support for the UN. And also, I think, like you mentioned earlier, the arms trade. I think you pointed out that Singapore is one of the top arm exporters in the world. To rank 20, and then like later ranked up a bit lower. My own research with the Burmese military deserters, young officers who occupied strategic positions within the Ministry of Defense, as personal staff officers to, vice chief of staff, or like, vice chief of this or that. They told me on the record that Singaporean arms manufacturers, obviously it's a state, they will come and test their medium range weapons, like the artilleries, or like a short range weapons in places like Burma, and then they would shoot promotional videos for arms expos around the world, and then leave those weapons as gifts to the Burmese military, right? And so that's another issue. That there is a triangle of like a Singapore, Israel, and Burma, because, as you know, Singaporean arms industry was or has been developed with massive, technical and technological support by the Israeli weapons experts. They are given PR in Singapore, and obviously the Israel Singapore connection goes deeper, because Singaporean armed forces was built with massive help from Israel, because Lee Kuan Yew was unable to get any support from other states. So he went to Israel and received the massive collaboration and support to build up the Singaporean armed forces, right? So I think like yesterday there was a meeting in Jakarta of the ASEAN foreign ministers. The Singaporean foreign minister was there as well, and I've noticed since the coup, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of Singapore have been saying that Singapore doesn't really have a much leverage with the Burmese regime, and sanctions not going to work, right? Now, like Singapore has been in the camp within ASEAN that is calling for tougher stance from the regional association against or towards the Burmese military, right? Yesterday meeting, was conducted without the Burmese military representative. And so, but Singapore is making this tough noises, but it doesn't really square with its deep engagement and the substantial leverage that Singapore has in terms of Singapore being the shelter for the Burmese military cronies, dealers, and including the Burmese military leaders. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean that will be simply the Singapore, folk tongue speak. To be clinical, what they just said was they want the ASEAN sanction, so they are looking for a multilateral approach. They don't say anything about bilateral. I think it's important to understand that the Singapore Foreign Service is a service that has been uniform for over 60 years. It has only one political master. So they have not been able to adjust to other political masters. So they have one speak. That's why you will note the temerity of the diplomats, especially the retired ones, the tone, the body language they adopt when they speak overseas, because they seem to know it's a know-it-all, smart aleck syndrome, right? I've seen many of them, been in the same room with them, and the tone they take, is a know-it-all, because they have the certain temerity of being very close to the political elite, and then because of the wages they earn, they also, have that, thing about them. So I think first of all, this is a multilateral approach.
The arrogance and the air of superiority.
That's right.
The rest of Southeast Asian diplomatic corps.
That's right. Yeah, and the other thing is they don't mention the bilateral approach, right? Because they have the bilateral approach, and that's what the U.S. Has officials have mentioned. But with the U.S. It's not very different, right? They're not going to pressure Singapore to take a bilateral stance against unless the U.S. feels that this is strategically important, and they have enough leverage over Singapore to do so. So I think those are the things. But for me, I think in even preparing for this chat with you, what I see is there is a body of information around Myanmar and Singapore relationship that's going back a good 30 years. And it's many smoking guns, literally. What we need is, we need to compile this evidence. I think we need to collate them, we need to cross-reference them, and I think we need to, put them all together as a big chunk. So that it is not piecemeal and scattered across little magazines in the past, or a few internet posting. I think we need a consolidated document.
You mean a dossier on Singapore's and its criminal collaboration with the one of the worst regimes in the world, and certainly the worst criminal regime in ASEAN. And so, sorry to interrupt, when you say the Singaporean foreign ministers are advocating sanctions multilaterally by the entire ASEAN, towards towards its black sheep of Myanmar military, right? But I mean, it's a dead end, as you know, right? I mean, they maintain the 5-point consensus as a goal, as a blueprint. When everyone in their right mind decided that this 5-point consensus, adopted back in April in Jakarta, with May Online in participating in that summit, which hosted by Jokowi, did not produce any desired outcome, even by ASEAN's very low standards. And so we are looking at a scenario where the United States, UN Security Council, and others have shoved the Burmese problem onto ASEAN's lap, right? And then, within ASEAN, we know that there are disagreements between different actors, roughly in two camps. One was in the Vietnam, the others authoritarian states that say whatever, like, just nudge the Burmese regime. And then, like, Malaysia and Indonesia want to push for a harder line against the regime. And Singapore is playing this game, say, while it maintains massive economic and financial leverage, uh, 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 with Singapore being the shelter for the regime and the regime linked cronies and others, saying that we need to have a multilateral, ASEAN-wide approach. Why are they not taking this, bilateral, approach? They're going to the Burmese military and say, look, we can no longer do business with you when you are killing civilians indiscriminately. Just like on 4 or 5 days ago, on the 23rd of November, the Burmese Air Force launched airstrikes against, civilian concerts, held in the Kachin area, killing like 80 civilians and injuring 100. Then the Burmese military also blocked off the area where the wounded individuals are stuck. They're not allowed to be taken to hospitals in Myitkyina or larger towns. And so, what explains Singapore's inaction, despite its rhetoric for pro-democracy, return to civilian rule?
It's simply the lack of pressure. I think if you need Singapore to act, you need a call for action will require three important strengths. First, I think you need more evidence-based research. Some of them, or quite a lot of them is in the public domain, as you and I exchanged today, to show that linkages, that evidence that Singapore does have the average leverage over Myanmar and to push those buttons bilaterally. In doing so, one has to also keep in mind of the Singapore nationalism. There's a whole bunch of people who are socialized into thinking that Singapore can do no wrong, that calling out Singapore may actually be anti-Singapore. So you'll have to manage that blowback. So the first call of action is more evidence-based research. The second call for action is really the Burmese in Singapore. Again, there's 200,000 of them. They need to keep tabs on what's happening in Singapore. They need to keep their eyes and ears open. They don't have to publicly out themselves in terms of what they're doing. The Burmese only know too well, even those who are generous and gave some money to civil disobedient movements had their bank accounts closed in Singapore. So you can see whose bank accounts are closed and whose are not.
Wait. Let me get this straight. You are saying Burmese citizens working in Singapore, like about 200,000, right? Roughly, as you said, and the majority of them work as like the domestic workers and shop assistants and whatnot, right? Not weapon scientists or doctors or engineers, in majority of them, and they want to send money to support peaceful demonstrators in Burma or Myanmar that participate in boycotting government services and ministry, right? You call it like a civil disobedience movement, CDM, right? So the Singaporean banks and government or authorities in general have shut down small Burmese citizens working in Singapore, sending a little bit of money to support their friends and families that wanted to change the Burmese military through peaceful protest and boycott. And then the Singaporean authorities continue to allow the Burmese cronies and drug lords and crooks to keep their bank accounts with their hundreds of millions of dollars of ill-gotten wealth. Am I correct? I want to make sure that this is clear.
Yeah, let me just outline the facts here. There was immediate rush to support the civil disobedience movements with financial support. When this was happening, the Singapore reaction was to ask banks to heighten their scrutiny over financial flows to Myanmar. That was the first step. Second, they were asked to stop authorizing the transfer of any items that may be used to inflict violence against unarmed citizens. And third, yes, I mean, these are publicly reported. One particular bank closed accounts of some nationals residing in Singapore, including several who raised funds to fight the junta. Overall, banks these days in Singapore are increasingly strict when it comes to new account opening by Myanmar individuals. So these are the facts. So what then transpired is the informal way of sending money. And I won't go into detail.
Yeah, we don't need to get into that subject.
Yeah. So those are the facts. So, but I'll come back again to the call for action. One more evidence-based research to expose this linkage to the role of Burmese in Singapore, but also Burmese, back home, who can observe some of these inflows into Singapore and keeping an eye. And I think there is the second call for action for the Burmese themselves to be involved into this evidence-based research is important. And last but not least, I think the US also has a part to play. It should lean on its SG partners to more effectively lead on Myanmar issues, and the US, if it's interested in doing the right thing, should support, work such as this evidence-based research. So, we have the facts. Because if we don't have the facts, you don't have the smoking gun. Singapore will do the same thing that it always does. It will say that you have not got it right, because the standard refrain is, look, we don't take sides in a conflict. We don't give special treatment to anybody. Everybody, follows the rules and regulations. There's no partial treatment, so on and so forth. We have had many, many public incidences like this, including the late, the former Sri Lanka president, who spent
Rajapaksa, and also I think like Mugabe was also using Singapore as his safe haven, right?
Sure, and he had his children here in Singapore studying, and they always find some way and conduit to manage this relationship. Our job as researchers is really to find the evidence and get the smoking gun. Even, of course, they will still deny it, but still it's out there, effectively collated, and that's what we can do.
Yeah, I think like in that regard, Justice for Myanmar. They have been doing extremely valuable and a very professional, work of exposing with documents and evidence, the various ties. And I think like it has, issued public statements with facts and evidence about these entities operating in Singapore, and it's. You are absolutely right. As researchers, what we can do is, construct the facts based on the evidence that can be made available to the public and international community. But thanks so much, James. My distinguished guest today is Dr. James Gomez, the Regional Director of Asia Center and one of the best researchers on a number of different topical themes, including the information, misinformation, the use of social media. That he is a Monash-trained scholar, and he's based in Southeast Asia. Thank you so much, James. Finally, anything that you want to add to?
No. Happy to be on the program, and we'll give you a shout out. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. You have a great day. Good evening.
Okay.